Great. We have our next panel now. Sorry. A wonderful panel on competitiveness, and I'm going to welcome, we're going to have Congressman Dan Kildee of Michigan is going to be online. We have member of the European Parliament, Eva Maydell, Karan Bhatia, Head of Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google, and Hendrik Bourgeois, Intel Government Affairs. Sorry, you guys were going to just wait out there forever until I introduced you. I remember I once had to host a dinner party when I was first ambassador, and I didn't know that if I didn't say bon appetit, no one would eat. So bon appetit. We're really happy to be having this conversation, and it turns out we're having it at a perfect time when Europe is debating exactly these issues about competitiveness. And it's been a priority of our President, Heather Conley, to make sure that we spark a conversation about allied competitiveness, that the U.S. and Europe don't get into a zero-sum situation that diminishes each of our economies and our ability to compete, to create jobs, to have security. So we really want to emphasize that. We'll be doing a lot more work on that, and we really appreciate your all being here to help us kick off that conversation. And I wanted to start with Congressman Kildee, if you don't mind. You're from Michigan. You sit on the very important Ways and Means Committee as well as the Budget Committee. Can you just talk to us a little bit about competitiveness from the point of view of if you're a European, you might think that the U.S. is just being protectionist when you see something like the Inflation Reduction Act, when you see Buy American provisions. And can you explain a little bit more to put it in context in terms of the priorities that the U.S. is focused on in terms of national security, climate, what have you, and also the investments that we're making at home?
Well, yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, and thanks for inviting me. I sure wish that I could have been there in person. But as I'm sure you know, the reason I'm stuck here in Washington is that we are very close to being able to deliver significant support, national security support for Ukraine and also Taiwan, Middle East. So my presence here, I hope, is well justified by the fact that what we're doing is intended to deal with the more fundamental questions of security that we have to continue to work together on.
Absolutely. We thank you for that work.
Thank you. I will admit I'm frustrated about how long it has taken us to get to this point. It should not have taken this long. And there's a consequence for the time that has been lost, but we will get it done. But specific to your question, there is some tension embedded in this conversation in the sense that from the U.S. standpoint, in order for us, I think, to do what is necessary, and that is strengthen our partnerships globally, and particularly strengthen our partnership with Europe, our economic partnership more specifically, it starts from a place of us having to rebuild our own manufacturing capacity in the first place. As you mentioned, I come from Michigan. I come from the city of Flint, Michigan, my hometown, a place that has had a lot of difficulty economically. And so I think we are in a position where to start, much of what we've done in the last Congress, Chips and Science Act, Inflation Reduction Act, while it has elements that we clearly need to address in terms of our bilateral and multilateral relationships with our significant allies, it's intended to help us engage on that front from a position of greater economic strength, rebuilding our manufacturing base, particularly around important technologies, particularly around renewable energy, and in my case, a particular focus on electric vehicles, for example. And I'll just finish by saying one other thing. Things have changed in the United States in terms of our approach to trade broadly. Part of that, I think, unwittingly, if you don't mind me using the term, in the term of the former president, Mr. Trump, who did usher in a new conversation, and I think allowed Democrats in particular to take that and move with it. For example, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement is a trade agreement that, from our perspective, sets a new tone and a new structure for the way we can engage trade with very strong labor standards, not just written on the page, but with an enforcement mechanisms that do allow us to increase trade and elevate workers on both sides of that trading relationship. And I'm talking about the US and Mexico, Canada, obviously, as well. The reason I mentioned that is that coming from a trade skeptical part of the country, one that has been hurt broadly historically by trade, one wouldn't think I would be so bullish on engaging new trading relationships. But I actually think some of the challenges that we face as between the US and the EU on issues of digital markets, on critical minerals, but most importantly, on some of the threats that we see coming from the non-competitive practices that China engages in that affects us both, I think can be best addressed by the US and the EU entering into a full enforceable, comprehensive free trade agreement, a US-EU trade agreement. We don't do it unless we start talking about it, unless we start saying it and walk away from these voices who say that's too much to ask for, that's too big a leap. My view is, let's move in that direction. I think that's important because I think we can deal with many of these issues, these areas of angst, if we get together across the table and work out the details and have an enforceable agreement that the United States Congress would then ratify.
That's a great start to this panel. Thank you. Even Maydell, you've done work on semiconductors, on cybersecurity, on data. Maybe you can give us your perspective. In Europe, there's sluggish economic growth. We see there's war, rise of assertive China. Where do you see the possibilities for not only competitiveness in Europe, but work across the Atlantic on these issues?
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you so much for having me, and glad to be joining this distinguished panel. Indeed, I think we live in a way more unsecure, unpredictable world compared to when the mandate of the EU institutions started 5 years ago. Geopolitics are much more tense than they've ever been before. And most importantly, our economies are not keeping up with the economies of some authoritarian actors. And this is why I have called for quite some time, but now more than ever, I think we have to elevate our partnership. It is time for us, I think, not just to call ourselves allies, but to think in strategic terms and be strategic allies. But I think to do that, maybe a little bit of a change of mindset is needed in terms of how do we actually do it? How do we get there? Because often we think about the other side of the Atlantic. For our side of the Atlantic, we always think we're right, and probably the other side of the Atlantic thinks, well, we are always right.
Oh, no,
in
we
our
never
approaches.
think that.
And so there's 3 brief points I would like to bring, and one is related to the TCC, the other one is related to chips, and the third one to supply chain. On TTC, I won't be as probably honest and critical as in some of my private conversations. I will try to be constructive here because I do believe it was a good first step on how to think more strategically about topics related to tech and trade. And I would agree here that there's so much more to do, particularly on the trade part, but also as someone working on a lot of the tech files and tech topics also in that domain. So I think we'll need to rethink how this cooperation could be brought to a different level, how it could become more efficient, more goal-oriented, and instead of having horizontal groups working on at the same speed on certain issues, we need to have priority areas. We can have a parliamentary dimension, but most importantly, find areas where certain progress can be made within every 6 months of each meeting. And there are just very few areas where that has happened, I have to say. On chips, I should, I would like to, from a European perspective, I would like us to see how we critically reimagine Europe's chips policies. There's an increased use of dual technologies. They're all relying on semiconductors. I think it's very important from an EU perspective to see the importance of the topic, not just of ramping up production, but more importantly, safeguarding our democratic values through, if necessary, seizing control over key technologies. And here, I think there's much where we can work together and pursue a way more ambitious, cheap cooperation framework, one that can formalize in one way or another our strategy on export controls, when it comes to China in particular, but in other areas when necessary. And my third point on supply chains, I think we should complement each other's investments in critical supply chains. There is absolutely no need to try to outbid each other. We could divide and conquer, and we'll probably be way more successful. But building up a resilient, building up interdependent transatlantic semiconductor, for example, supply chain could be a much needed start.
Thank you. Thank you. I see the congressman nodding, and I think Hendrik may have a thing to say about chips. But Karan, if you don't mind, we were just talking about AI. I think there's some concern in Europe that many of the leading AI companies, though certainly not all, are American. Can you talk about how AI might play into European competitiveness? Is there still a big opportunity here?
Karan, absolutely. I think when you step back and you think about sort of what AI can bring in terms of productivity enhancement, frankly, one of the great challenges Europe faces is demographics. I think this is an enormous potential solution on that front. But the reality is also that there is a lot of indigenous talent. We're already seeing it in great European innovation here. When we step back and we look at just simply the numbers, right, potentially 8% GDP improvement in Europe, $1 trillion plus or euros plus in terms of growth just enabled by AI in Europe. So we do think that there is a terrific opportunity. The reality is that right now the innovation is happening on both sides of the Atlantic. Whether you're within a company like Google, and we are innovating, we're doing some of our greatest AI innovation in Europe as well as in the United States, it's naturally flowing. What I don't see as much, and to Eva's point, is the alignment happening between governments on this, or frankly, on a variety of technology policy areas. I very much agree with the assessment of the TTC. I would love, Congressman, to see a full comprehensive free trade agreement, including a digital chapter between the US and the EU. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that's in the offing right now, but maybe AI actually affords us a new opportunity that doesn't get caught in the history of all the other technology agreements, because AI is actually a new technology in a sense, or it's certainly not being regulated as such. We are seeing signs of somewhat different approaches being taken to sort of guardrails around artificial intelligence, although I do think there is the opportunity to create some alignment there as well. But the other space that I think bears meriting is policies being adopted to incentivize artificial intelligence, to create opportunity, which really get around to skilling, movement of people across the Atlantic and between the two economies. Infrastructure. AI is going to require significant infrastructure build. How can we collaborate in that space? And then obviously in terms of government policy around building databases, enabling access to them. So there is a tremendous amount of possible, I think, convergence to happen on that front, which could give rise to really a transatlantic AI-generated economic boom that I think will benefit both the United United States and Europe.
Great. Maybe we can look to some of the work that's already happening in chips, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you see happening. I mean, as companies playing on both sides of the Atlantic, how you see policy working together, and also maybe sometimes creating some unintended consequences.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much for the question. I'm delighted to be here. Let me start off by saying that I don't think there's a better example that I can think of to talk about allied competitiveness or the need for a strong and vibrant and well-functioning transatlantic partnership than by talking about the semiconductor industry, because this is a sector where both the US and the EU are facing exactly the same challenges, or at least very similar challenges. And both the US and the EU would benefit from a joint approach in tackling those challenges, and they would be better off by doing it jointly than by pursuing these challenges separately. And the challenges are well known, right? Number one, there's been a very strong deterioration of the US and the European Union's share in global manufacturing in semiconductor. Europe is now at 9%, US probably a bit more, double, but still together approximately 30%. And 20 years ago, and the rest is in Asia. And 20 years ago, it was the opposite. And so there's an excessive dependence on suppliers from Asia. And the other risk is that if there would be an abrupt interruption of supply chains from Asia to the West, the economic damage would be terrible, just terrible. And so I think there's been a common understanding and common identification and definition of the problem, and that's why both the US and the EU have developed their own separate industrial policy to deal with semiconductors. So the US CHIPS Act, the EU CHIPS Act, and that's great. The problem is the cooperation between both has been quite underwhelming in this area. And there's a lot of opportunities that have been missed, and perhaps in the future we'll be able to address them. But basically, the US and the EU have been focusing mostly on this issue of avoiding a subsidy war, which is, not unimportant, and it's great. And both countries should be commended for promoting good stewardship of limited financial public resources, but there's so much more that the partners could do in the area of manufacturing, of complementary investments, in the area of innovation, in the area of skills. If you think about it, AI, will need semiconductors and does need semiconductor technology, and so we need upskilling programs, reskilling programs. There's a lot that can be done in economic security also. As Europe is thinking about what the future of export control will look like in Europe, what foreign direct investments will look like in Europe, inward investments, all of these things could be better coordinated. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Can I just push you on that? When you talk about coordination, let's say in manufacturing, it takes so long to build a semiconductor plant. They're so expensive. How do you think about doing that? And is there a role for government in that? Should the companies be working together? Does government have the capability to do that right now?
Absolutely. So, first of all, these manufacturing plants are incredibly capital intensive. And so there's no way a company can build a fabrication plant, certainly for leading edge chips in Europe or in the United States, without support from the government, because that's what's been happening outside of the West. And in Taiwan has been subsidizing its semiconductor industry for years. And so you may not like the game, but if you don't play the game, you're going to be out of the game. So that's very important. And secondly, the semiconductor supply and manufacturing chain is diverse and complex. I mean, it starts with obviously research and development, which is a separate activity. Then you move on to design. And after design, you have front-end manufacturing, wafer manufacturing, and then you move to back-end manufacturing. You have advanced packaging, assembly, testing, substrate, all different types of industrial activity. And so in an ideal world, and I think that's what Eva was alluding to, you could see a bit more of a complementary approach in this industrial policy, where today what we've seen is basically the EU doing its EU CHIPS Act, the US doing its thing, and it's not been very sophisticated in that respect, right? You could have imagined a world in which, the European governments would have focused on one area, the US would have focused on another area. And that combined with strong supply agreements and maybe a trade agreement, which would be music to my ears as well, would have been a better outcome, I guess.
So we're going to just develop that strategy right here. I feel really good about it. Congressman, I wanted to ask you a question about how you talk to your constituents about some of these issues, because a lot of times, we're talking about industrial policy in terms of chips. We're talking about long-term investments. When we're talking about climate, sometimes we're talking about greater prices over, a shorter term, and yet we feel like it's going to make the economy overall healthier in the longer run. But sometimes it's easier for a constituent to understand a tariff than just understand this kind of trade and investment framework that you are putting forward. How do you talk to people in your district about that?
Well, it's a great question because these are complicated issues. And very often, specific to your question, it means telling people things that are perhaps hard for them to hear. The easiest thing to do is to pander to one's constituents. And I'm not thinking of any particular American political leader at this moment, if you know what I mean, and argue for a U.S. go-it-alone, tariff-based approach as if that will produce result. We know that it doesn't. We've already seen that in the 4-year term of the previous president. That approach did not work. It may have made people, feel good, but it didn't do anything to reshore American manufacturing, to build our manufacturing base. And it actually, I think, was counterproductive in terms of the relationships that we have with our real allies and our potentially even more significant trading partners. So when I talk to my constituents, what I try to do is explain to them that our long-term economic interest is to avoid the mistakes of the past. The U.S., I come from an auto-centric community. In the early 1970s, the U.S. failed to change our manufacturing policy to produce more fuel-efficient vehicles, for example. We paid a huge price for that. So I try to put it in sort of a historical perspective. It's not easy to do, but it's been a real transition for me, a Democratic politician from a older industrial state that has been hurt by trade, to suddenly being one of the leading advocates for trade agreements. It has to be seen as in our long-term economic interest. And it's also, and this guy goes to the other point, as we engage on this, it's important for us to be able to point to the benefits. Chips and Science Act is a good example. We are seeing increased investment, increased manufacturing. I was really pleased to hear the comment about ensuring that in order to go in this direction, we have to have government support. That these projects don't pencil out without government support. But that support has to go across the entire supply chain. Like, for example, it has to include the production of chip-grade polysilicon, and not just a fabricating facility, but the entire supply chain that's necessary in order to produce. But then, and I'll finish sort of where I started in the other point, we have to have a US-EU trade agreement, one that is comprehensive and addresses all of these questions so that we can build strength in our own manufacturing bases, build this new platform, but then join hands so that we're not in a position of unilaterally trying to deal with the uncompetitive practices that our principal competitors are engaging in. The strength of a U.S., not just the U.S., but North American alliance and a European EU alliance joining together, it doesn't solve every problem, but if we can address that together, build our own capacity, and then use that strength jointly to try to address these issues, to take on, for example, Chinese electric vehicles that are obviously beginning to undercut the market of auto manufacturing in Europe and has the potential for that same threat for us. We can't look the other way. we've got to engage on this. And I think we're much more able to do that if we have a comprehensive agreement that sets the rules of engagement and creates a more formal alliance around these issues.
And even Maydell, you brought up supply chains and you brought up critical minerals. A lot of those are not produced in the U.S. or Europe. How are you thinking about that? How are you thinking about the U.S., how the U.S. and Europe can work together, and how we can work with others, even though they're not some of them may not naturally be allies or democracies?
Yeah, well, a couple of points also where and in which areas maybe we can collaborate. So I just got reminded, because we spoke a little bit about the TTC, but I got reminded, and no one has actually recently mentioned, there was a meeting between President Biden and Ursula von der Leyen a couple of months ago. It was the big US-EU meeting. And sadly, it did not produce very concrete outcomes. It came at a very unfortunate time in a global situation that was difficult, but one could look at it as a failure of the administrations to come with concreteness. But we are also part of that. So perhaps at their next meeting, we need to make sure that the final conclusions and remarks bring forward more concreteness. I like to see it, I mean, maybe the way for politicians to see it and to feel that they can own those ideas is to look at them as some sort of wins. So if we explain in numbers, and I know there's various organizations that are doing this, but perhaps prior to those meetings, bringing the numbers of our strategic alliance and having a transatlantic approach in key areas might make it more appealing to come with concreteness. And I'll give an example of a few areas. Of course, semiconductor is one of the areas that we spoke quite extensively today about. And no wonder, without semiconductors, we won't be able to operate in any given sector, not to mention the most crucial and important sectors. Speaking of AI, the only way we are going to win that race, that global race, it's going to be by making sure we have the compute power and the data. If we miss that, and semiconductors are the basis for that, it would be very difficult to win that race. So that would be an absolutely key strategic area, must be the first type of area where we need to speed up our collaboration. Then I would like to see, particularly in the areas, but also others that you mentioned, a more coordinated investment mindset and thinking. And sometimes that also happens through public-private partnerships. It could be in the area of clean tech. We've launched and I've supported a project called the Transatlantic Green Marketplace. We could call it Green and Tech Marketplace. We could expand it. But this was a concrete project that has started within the frameworks on the margins of the TTC, which addresses exactly the points that you've mentioned. So there's a way that we could align our approaches so we don't do the same thing and bid for the same sort of companies or materials that we need. And maybe a last point that I don't want us to forget, and I don't think we would, and this is probably where we've made quite some advancements, but it's an ever more important point. We are the transatlantic alliance of democracies. And in a situation where the situation that currently Ukraine is facing, we have to remain steadfast supporters. We have to be faster, we have to be better in our delivery of military aid, of humanitarian aid, of financial aid, of ammunition. And I think showing that this alliance of democracies can work even better together basically sends a clear message to all these other states. Sometimes those are states that we can barely collaborate. Sometimes there are states, which I think there was a GMF report some years ago, called them geopolitical swing states. So they would like to cooperate with you on certain areas and not in others. And very often we'll need to bring them on board. And we have different ways and means to do that. And again, our strengths are different. So if we see this in a very strategic manner, will be important. And maybe final point, because everyone would agree here in that room that maybe these are more or less, the right approaches. but then we don't put them to action. So how to make them actionable, how to put them in that document, that's a first step when our leaders meet, because lately the document hasn't been that concrete, and then make it actionable. And ideas are welcome.
Great. So you raised this issue, but how do we think about this not just in the transatlantic space? How does the transatlantic space fit into the broader conversation? And one of the things GMF thinks about a lot is, after the Second World War, all these multilateral institutions were created, NATO being one, but we have a whole host of others, and they're not feeling fit to purpose for the digital challenges, for the competitiveness challenges of today. So you were talking about AI, and maybe it gives us new opportunities because it's a new paradigm. How do you think about this transatlantic competitiveness debate and the need to create competitiveness in a broader global context?
Yeah, I mean, Karen, first of all, I should say I feel like it's a throwback to 15 years ago when I was, at that time I was Deputy USTR under President Bush. I've never seen this many free traders in a panel in the last 15 years. I love it. This is great. But just to step back for a quick second, yeah, look, I was just out in East Asia. I was meeting with Japan, Korea, and so forth. They are thinking very, affirmatively, progressively about how do they lean into this new set of technologies, how are they going to adopt them, how are they going to incentivize them. So there's unquestionably a competitive dynamic that's going on here that is going to it is already flowing into different regulatory approaches around the world, point number one. Point two, I completely agree with your point. The international institutions that existed, WTO as an example, are not at their strongest right now. They weren't built necessarily for the kinds of trade we're seeing today. The rules, the norms are a little off, and they don't have momentum behind them. So, in light of that, at point two, number three, I would just very quickly say, given that what we have seen is just an explosion of discrete, disaggregated regulation around the world, particularly in the technology space. Take APAC just as one example. In the last 3 years, 1,300 new regulations adopted by countries in that region, just applicable to companies in the internet space. That's an average of one a day. Now, if you're Google, it's even a challenge for us to be able to keep building and rebuilding products to do that. If you are the vast majority of companies out there, you just simply back off and you say, I'm not going to be working in that many markets. I'm going to pull back. And that's to the detriment of everyone. It's to the detriment of companies in Europe and the United States and more broadly, which I guess takes us to the final point of what then it does. If the transatlantic relationship can simply get its head around the fact that if it doesn't create that common set of standards, at least around artificial intelligence, it is going to lose out to the rest of the world. And whether it's China or other Asian leading powers, they are already leaning in. So I'd say this is a matter of imperative. Maybe we haven't been able to do it anywhere else, but if we don't do anything other than this, creating alignment around common approaches, whether it's in the implementation of the US AI Act or in how Congress thinks about AI regulation going forward, I think is an absolute paramount imperative.
Thanks. I want to open it up to questions. We don't have that much time, but do we have, yes, here. And if you could state your name and organization and then try to end with a question mark.
Yes. Hello, my name is Max Drummond. I'm from CREAB, a public affairs consultancy based in Brussels, working on defense and security. So we've heard quite a lot about the tech industry today. However, as I'm working in defense, I'm curious about what your impressions are on the recently published European Defense Industrial Strategy, which aims to increase competitiveness in the European defense industry market. We have been struggling in Europe with this quite considerably, so maybe it's something we can learn from the US. So yeah, maybe your thoughts on that.
Okay, does anyone have a comment, Hendrik?
I think it's direly needed. I think that Europe need to upgrade its efforts significantly. I don't think Europe has a choice. We live in a world that is full of geopolitical challenges, particularly in our part of the world. And so I think that for the next European Parliament, the next European Commission, we're going to see an increased focus, policy focus at least, on defense. Whether or not Europe will be able to deliver on this is a wholly different question, because I think we Europeans, and I'm a European, we're very good at setting out the vision, the single market vision, competitiveness vision, and I'm sure we'll have a vision on defense. Implementing that vision is usually much more difficult and challenging in Europe, unfortunately, but I think it's a necessity, and I think it will depend on the ability of European citizens to internalize that this is a need, that it will have a cost, but that the cost of not doing it will be higher.
Great, yes.
Just a brief comment to add on what Hendrik said, and it applies to the defense topic, but also other topics. Einstein said, it's insanity when you try to do the same thing all over again, expecting different results. And often it strikes me what we are trying to do is exactly that. Speaking particularly on the defense strategy, my advice to the teams that were working on it when I saw a rough draft some time ago, and I'm not very familiar with the final version, and it's not my area of expertise, so apologize if I'm not very in-depth, but I said, you should go to Ukraine and see what they're doing, because that initial version was not including a lot of those new technologies that are being used and exploited by the Ukrainians. And so, some people did go and spoke to the digital transformation minister, who's also in charge of their drone army and so on. But the initial version was purely a document that could have been done prior to the war. So we really need to think in a very different dimension than what we are used to, particularly in that topic in Europe. And the same applies to competitiveness, and the same applies to the single market. It's time for new and different ideas, not a collection of everything that's been there for the past 10 years. One area where we can do better is supporting and financing our companies, be them in the defense sector or the tech sector in general. Well, how many years are we talking about the Capital Markets Union? Probably it won't happen in the form that we would want it to be happen. So it's time to bring in a new thing to the table that has the support of member states, that can have the support of the European institutions, and can ultimately start working. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I think what you say is just so important, that some of the pressures from the outside, some of the opportunities from the new technology are forcing us maybe to do some things we wanted to do for a long time anyway, but haven't been forced to make the compromises that we have to make. I think that's really interesting. Do we have some other questions? Yes?
Thank you so much. Teresa Fallon, Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. I'd like to pick up your points on the TTC. It seems like there's some skepticism if this will survive, if there is a Trump administration, and you mentioned a few reforms, but some people think that maybe it could be scoped down into 1 year, one meeting per year instead of once every 6 months, because they don't have a whole lot of deliverables for that. Another thing, that they could maybe scope it down and not have so many different groups. It's a big grab bag. I think there are about 13 to 15 working groups right now, so maybe they can make it more focused. You did mention, if you could expand a bit on parliamentary, how you wanted to expand the TTC to Parliament. I wasn't really clear what you meant by that, so thank you.
So maybe we'll take this opportunity, because we're running out of time. Just very quickly, we've all talked about a lot of priorities for transatlantic competitiveness. Maybe we could just say, what would be, you've talked about action, be actionable. What would be your first step to move away from just talking or just writing white papers to really moving ahead on the congressman set us out with this big vision of a trade agreement. What would be our first steps?
That's a
Not
tough question
towards that. Not
to
towards that. I'm
answer
saying,
on
what's
the
your
spot,
number
but
one priority?
I will. Well, I think we should. I mean, I would just give a very. My initial comment would be, because I mentioned we should do things differently, and one of the positive takeaways of the TTC has been that people got to know each other from the administrations. But those same people have about another 10 to 15 other priorities to deliver on a daily basis. So maybe from an administrative point of view, you would need a small team, maybe for 6 months or 8 months, just working on 1 or 2 concrete projects from both sides of the Atlantic and deliver on them. It's not about how often would you meet, it's about the deliverables in the end of the day, and find the best way to come up with that concreteness, like some of the things that I mentioned, like the transatlantic grain market space. You could expand it to tech or to trade.
Hendrik, if there was one priority, what would it be?
I would go and move to Michigan and vote for the congressman and make sure he gets elected and, run his campaign or contribute to his campaign, make sure, he gets into office to, deliver on a transatlantic trade agreement. I mean, that would be great. Jokes aside, I think on the TTC, it's been underwhelming. The deliverables have been limited, and as far as the semiconductor industry is concerned, there's a lot of very concrete stuff that we could do, and unfortunately, I think the principles of the TTC have not been good enough in getting industry involved. And so, concretely speaking, I would love to be able to, not during the ministerials, whether it's 1 year or 2 years, but in between. When the people in the staff and the administrators meet and prepare the meetings, it would be great to have more input from industry and from other stakeholders.
So on this transatlantic competitiveness, what would be your priority?
So look, I agree that the TTC has been underwhelming. I don't know that it is that any tweak, once a year, twice a year, reduce the number of topics, is fundamentally what is going to change things. This is, I don't want to sound overly simplistic, but truly, this is a matter of political leadership. This is a matter of vision at the end of the day. Do you have, on both sides of the Atlantic, convergence over a vision of that relationship? And in the U.S., you have far too many forces that are focused on Buy America and sort of a nativist spirit, and frankly in Europe you have too much focus on sovereignty that comes effectively as the undertone of like keeping the U.S. among others at hand's distance. The reality is, and new technology is demonstrating this more quickly than ever, if we don't come together, truly we will hang separately. And so my vision of what happens with the TTC going forward, it has to continue. There has to be that dialogue, but it has to be informed and amplified by a true political vision, a true commitment to transatlantic convergence.
Congressman, bring us home. What would be your priority for the next step?
Well, I agree with the comments that have been made, and the criticisms, concerns about TTC, I think, are accurate. And I think one of the ways to address that is this, not to be too self-serving. I support the Biden administration, Catherine Tai, our trade representative, our commerce secretary, all great folks. But in order for these relationships, I think, to have the heft that they need to be meaningful, it's important that Congress be a part of that process, not just conversation, but the process, because agreements that can be struck that transcend administrations, or at least the concern of the end of one administration and the beginning of another, I think undermine our ability to trust a sustainable agreement. And I think that by itself tends to minimize the heft that an agreement or that a forum for agreement might have. This is why, for the third time I'll say, coming from a trade skeptical community, a person who was once a trade skeptic myself, the answer is negotiating a comprehensive agreement that would be confirmed by the Congress and would sustain itself beyond the next election, regardless of the outcome of that election. I have my preference, but we ought to have policy and relationships that are not contingent on the short-term political whims of one election or another.
Well, I think we're going to follow up on that with next year's Flint Forum to complement the Brussels Forum. Thank you for this amazing panel.